Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing the Sharks 17-18 season, the final season before I have, of course, caught up to where I started this channel. So, the Sharks in the 2017 offseason were obviously somewhat disappointed with how they performed in the playoffs that year, a first-round exit at the hands of the Edmonton Oilers, who would eventually get eliminated themselves in just the second round. So not a great look for the San Jose Sharks. Doug Wilson in the offseason didn't really make many moves. It seemed as though he was maybe hoping for some of the younger players for the Sharks to step up going into the following year. Of course, looking towards the likes of Hertl to maybe step into his own, LeBanc, and of course, first round pick, 9th overall in 2015, Timo Meier was looked at to possibly be really enter his prime as a player or really get up there in terms of points. That would of course not end up being the case. That would be delayed a further year, but that's what Wilson seemed to be hoping for. And so there weren't really many big moves made this offseason. The other big thing that occurred in the 2017 offseason was the NHL's first expansion since the start of the millennium, adding the Vegas Golden Knights as the league's 31st team. So there was a big expansion draft. Teams had to protect certain players, and while a lot of teams did get hurt by this, take a look at the Anaheim Ducks. They ended up having to lose Shea Theodore, a very promising young defensive prospect. The San Jose Sharks ended up escaping this expansion draft pretty much unscathed, only giving up David Schlemko, who of course was pretty good for the Sharks in the 1 year he did play with them, but would end up falling off the face of the earth in NHL-wise in the following years with the Golden Knights, and wherever he went after that, I believe the Canadiens ended up picking him up. And so in the regular season, the 17-18 season, the Sharks were once again a pretty good team. They actually managed to improve on the previous year once again by a single point. So 15-16 season, 98 points, 16-17 season, 99 points, and this 17-18 season, 100 points flat. However, this still only put them third place in the Pacific Division, behind the Ducks and behind the Vegas Golden Knights, the NHL's newest team. In terms of offense, the Sharks were once again pretty lackluster, not really too much doing there. It was Brent Burns, the defenseman, once again leading the way, but instead of the 27 or 29 goals he had in the previous couple of years, he only ended up getting 12 goals and 55 assists for 67 points. Joe Pavelski as well, not a great season for him, at least goal scoring wise, though points were still there, 22 goals, 44 assists for 66 points. It was Logan Couture who was the leading scorer for the San Jose Sharks, as 34 goals, 27 assists for 61 points. Then it was Tomas Hertl, who, as I said, Doug Wilson was likely hoping for a better season than this, but Hertl basically the same as what he did the previous year, 22 goals, 24 assists for 46 points. Then Chris Tierney, surprisingly up here in the top 5, 17 goals, 23 assists for 40 points, and Kevin Labanc, 11 goals, 29 assists, and 40 points. It should be mentioned that, as I said, Timo Meier also, I believe, putting up about 36 points this season, and Joe Thornton with 36 points this season in just 47 games. Unfortunately, the previous year, the 16-17 season, as we know, Thornton got his leg injured at the end of that year, and in this one, Mikkel Bodker ends up falling on top of Joe Thornton, which ends up injuring his other leg. He didn't get to finish out the rest of the year, and while he was skating a bit in the playoffs, and it was rumored that if the Sharks had gone deep enough, it was possible he'd end up playing, Joe Thornton would not play another game for the Sharks that season, even though he was having a very good year. In terms of goaltending, Jones was once again pretty good, starting only 60 games this season, as Aaron Dell, backup for the Sharks, was looking pretty good. 30 wins for himself, a 2.55 GAA, which is about average, maybe slightly below average, and a .915 save percentage, which is also slightly above average, I would say. Into the playoffs, the Sharks would face off in the first round against the Anaheim Ducks. Coming into the playoffs, it was predicted that this series was going to end up being close. Of course, the Ducks were the team that made it to the Western Conference Finals the previous season before losing in that third round. And so with the 101 points going into this playoff matchup, it was said that maybe the edge would go towards the Ducks, but it would end up being close. But the Sharks completely turned over those expectations by completing their second ever sweep in franchise history. The first one against the Canucks in 2013, here in 2018 against the Ducks. 4 games, all is needed for the Sharks, and they limited the Ducks to only 4 goals throughout this entire series. A 3-0 win and a 3-2 win in Anaheim, and then back in San Jose and a massive 8-1 win, and then a 2-1 win to close out the series. And it should be mentioned that in that 8-1 win, the Ducks were getting blown out and were trying to pull out all the stops to potentially injure some of the Sharks players, slashes and hits and things like that, cross checks. And so it was a good thing that going into Game 4, the Sharks really held their composure and managed to finish out the Ducks so that this series didn't end up getting extended and the Sharks could actually potentially get injured. So going into the following round, in the second round, they'd face off against this new team, the Vegas Golden Knights. The Sharks had had very limited success against the Golden Knights during the regular season. They seemed to have trouble, especially when playing in Vegas, and the Golden Knights were the other team in that Western Conference to actually complete a sweep in the first round, taking out the Los Angeles Kings in just 4 games of their own. And in Game 1, the Sharks seemed quite shell-shocked. They got completely trounced, 7-0 victory for the Golden Knights, but in Game 2, still in Vegas, the San Jose Sharks actually managed to get a victory 4-3, though it did take 2 overtimes. And so with a 1-1 tie after the first 2 games in Vegas, this was about what the Sharks were likely hoping for. However, Game 3 came along, and while the Sharks played well, it would end up going to overtime, and a crucial Paul Martin mistake would end up winning this game for the Golden Knights, 4-3, taking the 2-1 series lead. Paul Martin had had a really weird season thus far. He was a big help for Brent Burns in the 16-17 season and getting him a James Norris, but this season he played the first couple of games, then sat out for a very long time just due to apparently injuries. He would eventually come back into the lineup. Joakim Ryan had established himself as the defensive partner for Brent Burns, but Joakim Ryan ended up getting injured, so Paul Martin stepped back in, and for whatever reason, even though Paul Martin was getting very few minutes during these games, he ended up playing all the way through up until this Golden Knights game, basically, where because of this crucial mistake, he would end up sitting out the rest of the playoffs, and that would actually end up being his final game as a Shark. Joakim Ryan would step in. So Game 4, the Sharks would actually manage to take a victory, a very good game played by them, 4-0 win, but they'd end up going back to Vegas with a best-of-3 series, and of course, Golden Knights managing to get the home ice advantage back for themselves. In Game 5, the Golden Knights would come out to a 4-0 lead, and while the Sharks would manage to score 3 goals, they would be unable to complete the comeback and would lose 5-3, and while there was hope that the Sharks could get the victory on home ice and get to a pivotal Game 7, it would just not really be in the cards. While the Sharks did not look terrible in this Game 6, they just couldn't really get any of the bounces to go their way, and they'd end up getting shut out, losing 3-0. The Golden Knights would eventually also win the third round against the Jets before being eliminated in 5 games by the Washington Capitals for the Stanley Cup. In terms of playoff stats, it would be Couture once again here leading the way. 4 goals, 8 assists for 12 points. All of these players, barring Kane, played 10 games. Evander Kane, of course, acquired at the trade deadline this season, only played 9 games. Tomas Hertl, which could have been sort of foreshadowing of what he would become in the following years. Of course, he'd really end up stepping into his own offensively during that 18-19 season, but in the playoffs, 6 goals, 3 assists for 9 points. Then it would be Joe Pavelski's 2 goals, 6 assists for 8 points. Brent Burns next, 3 goals, 4 assists for 7 points. Then Bodker making an appearance here, 1 goal, 5 assists for 6 points, as well as Evander Kane's 4 goals, 1 assist for 5 points. Martin Jones had a spectacular first series against the Anaheim Ducks. As I said, just 4 goals allowed in the 4 games played. He was not as great against the Golden Knights. He got pulled a couple of times in that first game. Certainly not his fault, considering how awful the Sharks just looked in general. And anyways, in the end, Jones' stats still looked quite good, even if that Golden Knights series wasn't fantastic for him, though it was still solid because of the fantastic Anaheim Ducks series, a 2.26 GA and a .925 save percentage. So going into the offseason, since this is going to be the final season review video, I'll discuss the 2018 offseason. The Sharks, unlike the previous year where Doug Wilson was hoping sort of the status quo would be able to help, the Sharks wanted to make a big splash, and of course the big sweepstakes during that offseason was where would John Tavares, a star player for the New York Islanders, actually end up signing. The New York Islanders, John Tavares, it looked like he could potentially stay with the Islanders, but did want to test the waters in free agency. The Lightning were involved, the Stars were involved, the Leafs were involved, the Sharks were involved, and down to the final 3, it was the Sharks, the Leafs, the Islanders. Eventually the final 2, it seemed as though he was deciding between the Sharks and the Leafs, but in the end, Tavares decided to go with less money, as it was reported the Sharks had offered him $13 million a year, which would have made him the highest paid player in the NHL. And he decides to go with the Leafs as his hometown team, and that's, of course, where the infamous or famous, depending on what fan base you are from, picture of John Tavares in Leaf pajamas arose. Now, it didn't seem like Doug Wilson wanted to give up at that point, even though he missed out on John Tavares. He decides to make a massive, confident trade to acquire Erik Karlsson, who had been rumored to be on the trading block from the Ottawa Senators, in exchange for a massive price tag, a pool of players including Chris Tierney, Dylan DeMello, and a Sharks top prospect, not the top prospect, but one of their top prospects, Josh Norris, as well as a solid young player in Rudolph Balcers, plus a bunch of picks and a bunch of conditions for picks. And so, as we know now, this trade hasn't panned out that well. The Sharks ended up doing pretty poorly in the 1920 season, and as such, the Senators will be picking third overall thanks to the Sharks. But at the time, it seemed like a trade that could work out for the Sharks, and as we know, it almost did in that 18-19 season. But that is, of course, the story for, well, videos of past by me. But that will do it for this review, as well as this series, as we have finally caught up on the Sharks' history of this decade. And while there was certainly a lot of struggles in it, there was also a lot of high moments, and the Sharks clearly asserted themselves as one of the better teams of the past 10 years. Class dismissed.